Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. There's some folks still logging on, and thanks to those who are writing in the chat box where you're calling in from. It's really fun. So my name is Andrea Nandoskar, and I'm the Education Program Manager at Historic Hawaii Foundation. And I want to thank you for being here today for the third presentation of our 2021 Experts at the Cathedral Lecture Series. I want to send a big mahalo to our event partner, Dr. Ralph Kam, who's the curator and coordinator of the expert series on behalf of the Historic Preservation Program, Department of American Studies at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. HHF is really pleased to co-sponsor this year's series, which explores the changing interpretations of national historic landmarks. Today's lecture will focus on the history and interpretation of Kalaupapa National Historical Park and will feature two speakers, cultural anthropologist ohulani McGuire and historian Chris Johnson. Just a few virtual housekeeping items. We are recording. The video replay will be available either tomorrow or early next week on the HHF website. And you can also watch the replay immediately afterwards on the HHF Facebook and YouTube pages. If you have questions, we encourage them. Please write them in the chat box as they come up. We will have some time at the very end to speak to your questions, and we will reply to as many as we can. For those new to Historic Hawaii Foundation, we are a statewide nonprofit, and basically we help people save historic places, sites that tell the stories of the multi-layered history of Hawaii. We do this through education, advocacy, assistance, and protection of and for historic places. I'd now like to warmly welcome our first presenter, Hulani McGuire, who hails from Moloka, Nui Ahina, where she grew up on a cattle ranch in Kewanui. After the sudden death of her father when she was 11, her family sold the ranch and she moved to Oahu. And she loves to travel. In 1983, she left Hawaii with her husband to drive cross country across the US for a year, and she stopped and camped at national parks along the way. This led to a 7-year hiatus on the mainland. In the 90s, Hulani returned to college to get the degree she never finished, and in 1996, she graduated from UH Hilo with a BA in cultural anthropology with an emphasis on Hawaiian studies. She's been working and living at Kalaupapa National Historical Park since 2009. And as a cultural anthropologist, she wears many hats, but her main job is to advise the park on cultural matters, be a liaison between the patient community and the park service. So she works with oral history, informal talk story with the patients, collects stories, documents, the buildings and the ethno-history of Kalaupapa. And she also helps families connect with Kalaupapa and assist them with general history questions and locating information from the Board of Health. I want to provide a warm welcome to Hulani. So you can turn on your camera and your video, and thank you.
Aloha, everyone. So I wanted to talk a little bit about my connection to Molokai and growing up there as a child. You know, Kalaupapa was not on my radar at all, except for occasionally going to the top of the lookout at Pala'au and looking down at the settlement. I really had no understanding of the history of Kalaupapa as a leprosy settlement. No one really talked about it. I don't remember hearing anything about it. We didn't learn about it in school. And it was like it didn't exist, and that part of the history never happened. I didn't relate to it at all. And then it wasn't until I was an adult and at family reunions, probably in my 40s, that I started hearing whispers about Kalaupapa and that we had relatives there. My uncle used to sneak down the trail to visit a cousin of ours and play music. One cousin in particular was more well-known because he composed the song Sunset of Kalaupapa, but he died in the 1950s. Years later, in December of 2000, I came to Kalaupapa for work That is when I started connecting the pieces, when I met a cousin who was a patient. Come to find out, I have family ties to at least 8 other patients on both my mom's and my dad's side of the family. They had passed away, but I was able to connect through meeting this cousin of mine and finding most of their graves. Prior to 2009, I and 2 other colleagues was contracted by the park to do an ethnographic study of Kalaupapa as a community. And this project lasted for 5 years, from 2001 to 2005. And then in 2009, the park found money to hire me. So I've been a total of 21 years working at Kalaupapa, involved with research and being involved with the work there. So that's a little bit more about my background, and it, especially in relation to Molokai, I kind of feel like I've come full circle coming back there to work, because that's the island I was born on. Okay, slide 1, thank you. So I wanted to offer for context a map of the island of Molokai. And in particular, I wanted to point out, a lot of people don't realize that there are 2 counties in Molokai, and Kalaupapa is its own county of Kalawao. And it's separate from the Maui County on the rest of the island. And it's specifically governed by Hawaii Revised Statutes 326 for Hansen's disease. Kalawao is a separate county under the jurisdiction and control of the Department of Health. And any other Hawaii Revised statutes regarding counties don't apply. So what this means, for practical purposes, is that the DOH makes its own rules. For instance, patients can drive without a license. Cars don't need inspections or safety checks. There's no car insurance. There's no tax on food at the state-run store, because the store was created for the benefit of the patients. And this was all to facilitate making life easier for them. And for example, driving down the road, they can be blind in one eye and still be allowed to drive. So the Kalaupapa rule is, if you see a patient driving down the road, you slow down and pull over on the side to give them the right of way. Being its own county allows the Department of Health to govern Kalaupapa how they want and make their own rules, and change the rules whenever they see fit. And one of the rules that they have put in, and it was at the request of the patients, is that no children are allowed to enter under the age of 16, except by special permission and special occasions. For example, the death of a relative, to come in for a funeral. Other than that, no children under 16 are allowed. So that's just an example of how they govern there. Next slide. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the land management. And most of Kalaupapa is state land administered by agreements. It makes a complicated and challenging situation, especially now as the patient population is dwindling. And at some point, the DOH will be transitioning to leave after there are no living resident patients. The park encompasses 8,725 acres of land and 2,000 acres of water. The Makai boundary extends a 1/4 mile out into the ocean. And Kalaupapa is unique and different from most other national parks in that almost all of the area within the boundaries are state-owned land, but managed by the NPS. The park only owns 23 acres now out near the airport, and it includes the Molokai Light Station, or the lighthouse. The rest of the lands are Department of Land and Natural Resources, which is most of the green area, and Department of Hawaiian Homelands, which is where the main settlement is today, to the left, the blue area on the left of the map right here. And I also wanted to point out that there were two settlements. The first settlement was on Kalawao on the right side of the map. And the main Kalaupapa settlement, as we know it today, is on the left side. Next map, next slide. I wanted you to see this aerial view of the peninsula and for you to get a sense of the remoteness and how difficult it is to get there. And once you're there, how difficult it is to leave. The peninsula is surrounded by 3 sides of ocean and an 1,800-foot cliff on the mountainside. There are stories of patients who tried to escape by swimming and they drowned in the attempt. Next slide. Kalaupapa as a leprosy settlement was specifically chosen for its geographic features, being remote and being difficult to access. So you can see this is a photo of the Kukui Ohapu trail. It's the only trail leading into the settlement. And you can see the zigzag. It's composed of 26 switchbacks, and it's about 3¼ miles long. The name came from a heiau that used to be at the top of the trail. During times of war, signal fires to Oahu were set in times of war, and firebrands were thrown over the pali. Next slide. So just to give you a sense of what was happening in Hawaii in the 1800s in relation to diseases. The right side is a list of all the introduced diseases. And since contact with the Western world in 1778, introduced diseases took a heavy toll on Native Hawaiian health in epidemic proportions during the early to mid 1800s. Not only was the Hawaiian population dwindling as an ethnic group, but birth rates were low. And the low birth rates are attributed to the prevalence of venereal diseases that were introduced by Western contact. Next slide. The Hawaiian king, Kamehameha V, was greatly troubled by the state of the kingdom and the health of his people. On December 13, 1850, he instituted a board of health to study health issues for the preservation and cure of contagious, epidemic, and other diseases, and more especially of cholera. In subsequent years, the Board of Health continued their discussions on the health of Native Hawaiians. In 1855, under the rule of Kamehameha IV, hospitals were instituted via legislative act. And in 1862, an act to establish an asylum was passed. Meanwhile, incidences of leprosy became more frequent. By the early 1860s, leprosy was noticeably present among the Hawaiian population, and it could no longer be ignored. Dr. Hillebrand, medical director at Queen's Hospital, suggested the board develop a plan to isolate leprosy victims from the rest of the population. At the same time, there was growing public sentiment in the Pacific Commercial Advertiser newspaper asking the Hawaiian government to address the problem of leprosy. In August 1864, Dr. Hillebrand again addressed the board, saying this time that leprosy was contagious and the only logical solution to stop the spread of the disease was isolation and segregation. Next slide. Since the Board of Health was established in 1850, 2 monarchs had died, and Kamehameha V was now the reigning king. On January 3, 1865, at the recommendation of his Privy Council, King Kamehameha V signed into law an act to prevent the spread of leprosy. The act authorized the Board of Health to set aside lands owned by the government for isolation, to arrest anyone suspected of having leprosy, and confine anyone who might be a threat of spreading leprosy, and to remove them to a treatment facility or a place of isolation as determined by the Board of Health. And when we say suspected, what really happened was they set a bounty, and you could have like a minor sunburn or a rash or a skin lesion, and maybe it wasn't leprosy, but people suspected you of having it, and they could report you and get the bounty of $10, and you would be arrested. Next slide. So we're going to fast forward to 1893, the year of the annexation and the overthrow of Queen Liliuokalani. And research by others indicates the spikes in patient numbers were highest in the years just before the overthrow and just before the annexation in 1898. At the highest number, there were about 1,100 people as sent to Kalaupapa as patients living there at the same time. So you can see that the political priorities were shifting. Next slide. So what does it take to build a community from nothing? What are the critical elements needed to endure isolation in an unfamiliar place with little or no infrastructure? I think about this a lot, especially in this time of the pandemic. What would it take for me to be happy in this place? And so, besides, of course, health being the most important thing, the patients were they relied on their religion, culture. There was arts and music and sports, and many of them were so self-reliant, and they started businesses. The patients a lot of the patients in, especially in the 1900s, would grow vegetables and have gardens, and they would sell their produce to the state store to be sold. And of course, communication as well was important. They developed an advisory council, a patient advisory council, so they could have a funnel of communication with the Department of Health. Next slide. So fast forward some more, and we come to 1949. Hawaii officially uses the terms Hansen's disease instead of leprosy. The leprosy victims were stigmatized and shunned as social outcasts by mainstream society. And it was a conscious decision by the territory of Hawaii to use this term instead, in an attempt to counteract the social stigma and bring a sense of dignity to the disease. So in historic preservation speak, the period of significance for the park is 1866 to 1969. And 1969 is important because that's when the law of separation was repealed. And from this point on, patients were free to travel. They could enter and leave Kalaupapa whenever they wanted without getting permission. And it really helped them to grow. I mean, there's stories in the 50s of patients that wanted to go to Honolulu to see their families, and the Department of Health made them sign an agreement saying that they would be sterilized once they got to Honolulu, be sterilized, and then they could see their families. And that actually happened up into the 50s. So the patient concerns opened the door for the NPS to come to the park. In the 60s and 70s, they started hearing rumors about developers wanting to come to Kalaupapa and build fancy condominiums for the rich and the famous. And the patients really wanted their history to be preserved. And they didn't want to see this beautiful place that they came to call home opened up to tourism. So one patient in particular spearheaded this movement, and that was Richard Marks. And they looked at all the agencies that they thought would be able to care for Kalaupapa, and they decided on the National Park Service. And so it was because of the patients that the National Park Service was able to be established at Kalaupapa in 1980. Next slide. So the park was established on December 22nd, 1980. We just celebrated our 40th anniversary in December, this past December. And so the purpose of the park, some of the highlights are to preserve and interpret the Kalaupapa settlement for the education and inspiration of present and future generations, to provide a well-maintained community, and to protect the current lifestyle of these patients and their individual privacy. And an interesting thing about our park is we have legislation that actually says to provide the preservation and interpretation of the settlement, and that it be managed and performed by patients and Native Hawaiians to the extent practical, and that training opportunities be provided such persons in management and interpretation of the settlement's cultural, historical, educational, and scenic resources. Next slide. So up until the park came, and actually even today, there's a lot of the previous interpretation over the years focus on the physical and emotional pain and suffering of the patients, and particularly Father Damien and the Catholic story. And this was partly because the tours were owned and run by patients who happened to be Catholic. And of all the religions that were established at Kalaupapa, there was Catholic, Protestant, Mormons, and Buddhists. The Catholics had the largest population, or largest membership, and that was probably because of Father Damien as well. And he was the first one there as far as the religious organizations go. Next slide. So the settlement has been here for 114 years before the park came in 1980. And what's in our Interbasket? We were the new kids on the block. And so these are some of the things that we use in our interpretation. And we recognize that there's a much larger and more inclusive story. And there's so many things that we have to highlight and that we can educate visitors on. And one of the key things, especially something the patients really wanted, was to highlight their life at Kalaupapa and the community and how it developed, and how they're really a normal community like any other community, even though they've had this disease, that they're just like everyone else. And as my cousin always used to say, we had a life. She'd tell me that many times. She says, we had a life. We're normal people. We're just like you. Next slide. So as I mentioned, we just celebrated our 40th anniversary. And so over the years, we've done work on baseline documents to inform us, and research has been conducted, and it's always ongoing. Our basket looks quite different now from when we first got there in 1980. The difficult thing for us is that we don't actually manage the tours, and we don't have much say in the content being given to the visitors right now because they're patient run. But we can plan for the future, and we're doing that using all of these topics in our basket. Next slide. So these are kind of highlights of some of our interpretive themes and education. And I'll just read through some of them. The cultural and natural landscapes, architecture, archaeology, that reflect the evolution of the settlement from barely surviving Hansen's disease patients to a highly organized medical and social community. We also want to acknowledge the work of others, including the Kukui, and those who would continue to inspire us through their selfless devotion to others in need. And besides Damon, we want to emphasize Mother Marianne, Brother Dutton, Jonathan Napella, Alice Kahoko'oluna. There are so many other people that have stories to tell at Kalaupapa. The natural resources is important as well. The plant and animal communities, seabird colonies, monk seals, and reef environment, and the geology. Also important as an interpretive theme is a sense of spirits, sacredness, and spirituality by virtue of the events, circumstances, and people who lived and died there. And I'm always kind of amazed when I talk to visitors, and they often mention without me asking how special and how sacred Kalaupapa feels. And there definitely is a sense of feeling the spirits there. And then another highlight, of course, is the patients themselves, their stories, their oral histories and traditions, and to acknowledge their adversity, but also celebrating their accomplishments and their triumphs. Another thing that we haven't focused on so much, but something that we are working on is the Native Hawaiian history, pre-1866, pre-settlement, including interpretation of archaeological and sacred sites. And then the Moloka light station and representing a symbol of hope. Next slide. So when it comes to interpretive planning, we have a draft long-range interpretive plan, but it's currently on hold because of COVID. But that plan also needs updating. But one of the things we want to highlight in that long-term plan is to involve Kalaupapa residents and descendants of patients and locals as cultural interpreters to help tell the story of Kalaupapa. Because really Kalaupapa is everyone's story. We'd like to focus more educational efforts on on-site learning and enjoyment opportunities that contribute to the preservation of cultural and natural resources. And one of the things that we've been talking about, and it's definitely a long-range goal, is to have a satellite location topside. And that's because the visitation to Kalaupapa is limited by the number of people that can come on the airplanes and the number of flights that come per day. So we'd like to have another venue to educate people about the history of Kalaupapa. And also to do museum loans and exhibits through partnerships outside of Kalaupapa. For now, the short-range interpretive plan is more effective, especially during COVID. Our park has been closed since March of last year, and it's not likely to open very soon. We're expecting it might even be closed for the next 6 months until the end of this year. So the way we can beef up our presence is through beefing up our virtual presence and social media for educational research, planning and curriculum development, to spend time on that versus deliverables. In this downtime, we can plan. And also update and replace our waysites with historic photos And this is new for us, revise the text in English and Hawaiian. And that project is scheduled to take place next year in FY, fiscal year 22. We also want to take advantage of new scholarly research. There's research going on outside of the park, and to take advantage of that new research to incorporate it into our interpretive information, and always to update. We currently have one interp in education and volunteer staff. And as the interpretation program grows, we hope to add on to that staff. And next slide. I think I'm done. Yeah, that's it. And so I'd like to turn it over to Chris at this point.
Thank you, Hulani. I'll just, thank you so much. I will just do a brief intro for Chris, and then you can join us, Chris. Our second presenter is Chris Johnson, a historian with the National Park Service, Interior Regions 8, 9, 10, and 12, and based in Seattle, Washington. His responsibilities include writing and reviewing National Historic Landmark nominations and providing technical assistance to partners regarding the evaluation, interpretation, and preservation of National Historic Landmarks and other historic properties. During his 10 years with the National Park Service, Chris has been involved in a variety of projects in Hawaii and the Pacific Islands. These include updating the NHL documentation for Kalaupapa leprosy settlement, preparing studies of Koloko Honokohau National Historical Park and the National Park of American Samoa, and facilitating workshops with Pacific Island historic preservation offices and other partners across the region. Chris, welcome.
Hi, thank you so much, Andrea, and thank you, Hulani, for sharing your experience and your knowledge. Really appreciate it. You know, this is actually this seminar is really great. Really great timing, since we just finished preparing a National Historic Landmark updated nomination for Kalaupapa. It was just signed by the Secretary of the Interior about a month ago, and so just for folks who may be not that familiar, the National Historic Landmark nomination is the official documentation that supports the designation of a historic property as an NHL. So it makes the case for national significance using defined criteria. It also provides physical description of the property, including analysis of its integrity. And so NHL nominations are, you know, they're essentially like technical documents. They're not always particularly, I think, accessible for general reading, and they're not really the be-all, end-all for understanding the history of a place, but they are important for the purpose of recognizing what are the important aspects of a place. And they can be useful tools to inform interpretation and management of cultural resources. Next slide, please. And occasionally they need to be updated. You know, many of the nominations for NHLs in Hawaii, for example, are really early, done in the 1960s and 70s, and so they're out of date and require updates. And so for Kalaupapa, there's a couple of reasons. There's a number of reasons why it was determined that updated documentation was necessary. But a couple of things to focus on for this. One is there was a need to document contributing resources there at the site, as well as changes to the physical condition and integrity of the NHL that have occurred over the years. And then also the goal was really to bring interpretation and understanding of the property's national significance up to date in accordance with, you know, a considerable amount of scholarship and new research and new interpretations that have emerged since the original nomination was produced in the 1970s. So next slide, please. So I want to focus today on three main themes that are included in the Kalaupapa nomination update. And Kalaupapa has a very complicated and multi-layered history, and so I can't cover everything today, but I want to focus on these three themes that I think can provide some context and really help support the directions and interpretation that Hulani was sharing with us. So the first is Kalaupapa connection to the colonial history of Hawaii. The second is a greater recognition of the significance of the lives, experiences, and contributions of the people of Kalaupapa. And the third is Kalaupapa's importance to the history of social justice and human rights efforts by and on behalf of persons affected by leprosy. I think a key point here is that while Kalaupapa's history is defined by separation, it is a place that's really deeply connected to all of the broader events and patterns of change that affected Hawaii, the United States, and really the world, all the way up to the present day. Next slide, please. So just in regards to this first theme, as Hulani mentioned, the introduction of foreign diseases that accompanied Western expansion and colonization really created this unimaginable loss of life for Hawaiians and really for indigenous peoples around the world. In Hawaii, 90% or maybe even more of the native population succumbed really in only a few decades after initial contact, largely as a result of disease. And it's important to recognize that leprosy was actually far less transmittable and far less fatal than many other diseases that affected Native Hawaiians at this time. But because it had this stigmatization to it, particularly in Western culture, it attracted it sort of compelled a particularly aggressive response. The disruption caused by disease and really a number of other developments associated with Western intervention at this time opened the door for these kind of Western fears and ideas about leprosy to inform public health policies implemented by the Hawaiian Kingdom. So this included things that Hulani mentioned, the passage of the Act to Prevent the Spread of Leprosy, establishment of the Kalaupapa settlement, and it should be noted also that the creation of Kalaupapa involved two main instances of forced separation. One is the separation of people affected by leprosy from their homes and families to Kalaupapa, but it also involved the displacement and eventual eviction of the native inhabitants of the Kalaupapa Peninsula, many of whom actually stayed on their land for as long as they could and assisted the population of patients there. And responses to leprosy also became intertwined with notions of racial difference in the context of American efforts to exert greater economic and political control in Hawaii. Board of Health officials, most of whom were white Americans, attributed the disease to Hawaiian characteristics and common practices such as sharing food or continuing to care for family members that are affected by the disease. And these kinds of assumptions function to justify not only the forced isolation of Native Hawaiian people at Kalaupapa, but also more generally a kind of white moral and political authority over the Native population. So with annexation and the establishment of a formal American overseas empire, fear that the disease might pass from Hawaii to the continent also motivated stricter enforcement of segregation in Hawaii, as well as greater attention to the supposed public health risk to the United States as a whole. So these concerns lay behind a number of developments in the US more broadly, the creation of the US National Leprosy Survey, establishment of the US Leprosy Investigation Station at Kalawao in 1909, and that's pictured, it's quite small, but it's pictured up there in that picture on the top on the slide. And this broader fear of leprosy as an imperial danger also prompted the development of large remote isolation facilities based on the Kalaupapa model in other areas of the world, from the Philippines to Puerto Rico to South Africa. And Kalaupapa was really the first of these kinds of institutions and one that really influenced these larger developments. And a key point that I want to make here is that the Hawaiian people were not without agency in this history. So the decision by the Hawaiian Kingdom to act on the recommendations of the Board of Health really reflected this willingness, which is actually consistent with kind of Hawaiian customs and oral traditions to adopt these introduced ideas that seemed necessary at the time to strengthen the kingdom and protect the people. But many more Hawaiians actively resisted the leprosy control measures, often by concealing family members from the police or escaping to places so they wouldn't be arrested and separated and brought to Molokai. For Hawaiians, really the physical effects of the disease were less concerning than the separation from family and land that was required under the policy of segregation. And this possibility of being sent to what some referred to as the living graveyard of Kalawao led many Hawaiians to refer to the disease as the separating sickness. And the people of Kalaupapa and their supporters also protested, through letters to Hawaiian language newspapers, petitions, testimony to special commissions, resistance to regulations, and even participation in the electoral process. Their actions inspired members of the royal family to visit the settlement and to enact measures to better care for citizens of the kingdom confined there. And in 1897, approximately 700 residents of Kalaupapa signed the petition against annexation, showing the way in which they were really vested in these kind of political changes that were happening that were affecting their lives. And you can go ahead and go to the next slide. And so this theme of resistance, I think, plays into the next primary theme here, which really recognizes the significance of the stories of the people of Kalaupapa, their voices and their role in shaping the community to meet their needs and preferences in the context of their forced isolation. And so this term, people of Kalaupapa, in this nomination really refers to the approximately 8,000 people that were sent to the settlement beginning in 1866, about 90% of whom were Native Hawaiian. But the term is also inclusive of others who lived at the settlement and helped those admitted there to improve their own lives. These included kokua, or family and friends who accompanied their loved ones in the early years to provide assistance, as well as the kama'aina, the native residents of the Kalaupapa Peninsula, who helped those sent there in the early years to find food and shelter and other essentials for their survival and comfort. It also includes religious workers, including Father Damien, who's pictured in the bottom picture, and Mother Mary Ann, both of whom have now been sainted by the Catholic Church. But it also includes a number of others that haven't received as much recognition from other denominations, like Jonathan Napella from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, as well as Protestant ministers such as Reverend J. Hanaloa and Reverend Alice Kahokualuna, who was I think the first woman to be ordained by the Hawaiian Evangelical Association. It was at Kalaupapa until the 1950s. An additional part of the goal of the update is to provide a more inclusive interpretation that emphasizes not only these kind of extraordinary, exceptional individuals that were important at Kalaupapa, but also the sort of day-to-day acts of resilience, of generosity, faith, joy, compassion, creativity that really define the character of the community. And this is represented in many different ways at Kalaupapa, but I do like this picture of Henry Corey raising the cross at Kauhako Crater with the help of the Boy Scouts. It kind of recalls that picture of the Marines, lifting the flag at Iwo Jima in World War II, but I think it really represents that kind of sense of community support. And that's such an essential part of Kalaupapa's significance. Go to the next slide, please. So the third topic is Kalaupapa's importance in the history of social justice and human rights movements regarding leprosy. So all these individuals pictured here, each played really distinct roles in advocating on behalf of the people of Kalaupapa, challenging stereotypes about leprosy, Bernard Punakaya down there in the car on the bottom left, and Richard Marks there with his wife Gloria were really instrumental in bringing about the repeal of the segregation policy in 1969. These individuals and others also really helped to articulate a human rights position on leprosy, insisting on this recognition of persons affected by the disease as creative and capable individuals entitled to dignity and protections in accordance with the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. And residents of Kalaupapa also began, later on in this history, began sharing their personal stories through oral histories, through memoirs in various ways. Olivia Bretha at the top there, her memoir, Olivia, My Life of Exile in Kalaupapa, was published in 1988, which is the first autobiography by a patient at Kalaupapa, which really invited readers to relate to her on a human level, to her experience of pain and anger, joy, love, and compassion. She was really trying to challenge stereotypes about people with leprosy. She also noted similarities between her experiences and the challenges faced by people affected by HIV and AIDS at the time that she was writing. And so all these stories are really important in helping to convey the human experience of Kalaupapa, really from the perspective of those who really made the settlement their home. They bring attention to the resilience of the people of Kalaupapa, their creativity, their commitment to one another, and the lives that they were able to create for themselves in the face of adversity and injustice. They really represent a really important part of Kalaupapa's ongoing legacy in ensuring dignified treatment of persons that are affected by leprosy as a human right. Let me go on to the next slide. And I know we're running short on time, but I'll try to move through this fairly quickly here. But the question is then, how do all these themes inform interpretation of the actual physical landscape of Kalaupapa, the resources that are present? And I think it does so in a couple of ways. It allows us to reinterpret familiar resources in new ways. An example would be the Siloama Church down there on the bottom left, which is a kind of important visible landmark at Kalawao. It was established, the original church was built in 1871, and it kind of represents the importance of religion at the settlement. But it also really served as a platform to organize the community and to make demands of the Board of Health. At one point, the members of the church chained up the settlement's first superintendent, Louis Lepart, demanding that he hand over livestock, food, and clothing. Lepart described the church and its members as a menace to the operation of the settlement, but for its members, it was really a means of ensuring dignity, of physical and spiritual comfort, and a measure of control over their lives. I should also mention, archaeological resources are very important, exemplified by the Hupua'a boundary wall there pictured. These represent both what Kalaupapa was like before the settlement, but also how the people that lived there experienced this transition from a agricultural and fishing community to a leprosy settlement. It also provides information about the lives of patients, especially in the early years, whose voices aren't recorded in the written record, so we can understand how they experienced those early years. Burial sites, like pictured there on the bottom right, are very significant at Kalaupapa. Some are associated with important individuals like Father Damien and Mother Marianne, but others, represent the thousands of other people whose names may not appear in the written record, and voices may not be heard, but who are also members of the community. And these burials are also, they serve as a genealogical record. They help, as Hulani, I think, was referencing, to help kind of connect people in the present to family members, who in many cases might have been considered to be lost to history. Next slide, please. And just a couple of other examples. This is the cross that I mentioned earlier. I want to mention the Kenso Seki house and garage. So, you know, it's easy to focus on his house. It sort of represents the architecture of Kalaupapa, you know, this Hawaiian plantation style that's common there. But I really want to draw attention to his garage. And there are many of these kind of patient-built outbuildings, garages, and workshops throughout Kalaupapa that are kind of understated and maybe not as noticeable as some of the more prominent resources, but are really important in the sense that they represent the agency of the people, you know, their efforts to kind of create lives for themselves. You know, Ken Soseki, who owned this place, he was known for, one of the things that he was known for was, you know, creating these little inventions that would help people, you know, that maybe didn't have good use of their hands. So like he invented a little device for pulling buttons through buttonholes or for opening a soda can. And, you know, you know, the car, you can see the car there. Also, there's an old rusting Model A that's in the front of the garage, which was his. And, you know, automobiles are kind of important in Kalaupapa. They're sort of symbols of mobility and independence. And so, you know, when we really focus on those more patient stories, we kind of, our attention gets drawn to these other types of resources. Next slide, please. And again, these are just some other examples along a similar vein. You have beach houses that are out on the western shore, sort of away from the main settlement. Most of these are built from salvaged or recycled materials by the patients, and were places where they could sort of have some freedom from the, you know, the busy life of the settlement, or from oversight from the authorities. You know, they could gamble or have parties or drink and do things that they might not be allowed to do sort of within the main settlement. You know, the bars where people would, you know, could gather and socialize. And so these sort of more understated resources, I think, kind of rise to take on a greater importance, I think, when we recognize these other kinds of stories at Kalaupapa. Next slide, please. So just briefly, just to conclude, I want to mention, just from a broader perspective from the National Historic Landmark Program and the National Park Service, there has been a real concerted effort, you know, over the past several years to tell, you know, a more inclusive story of American history through NHLs. And so produced a number of theme studies dealing with different topics like Latino history or LGBTQ history. The one that's most relevant to Hawaii is the Asian American Pacific Islander theme study, which came out, I think, in 2018. And I include this quote here. I just thought it's notable that actually the report actually leads off with this quote from Noenoe Silva, talking about this sort of confrontation with the legacy of colonialism. And I think that's notable for Hawaii. And I think it represents a kind of an acknowledgement by the National Park Service and by the NHL program that these kinds of stories are important and deserve to be told and deserve to be recognized in National Historic Landmarks. And so, you know, the Kalaupapa is an update is an effort. The Kalaupapa update is an effort to really kind of bring a new understanding of this place to an older nomination. But I think there are also, and there's a lot of opportunities, I think, to do that with other NHLs in Hawaii. And I also think there are a lot of opportunities for new NHLs that are, you know, places that are really significant to Hawaiians and to other communities that maybe haven't been as well represented in the program over time. So anyway, I want to encourage everyone listening to think about that, and I'd definitely be happy to discuss further with folks who are interested. And I can talk more about the process for designating an NHL as well. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'll leave you here at the end with this. This is a message from a Kalaupapa artist, Edcato, who painted these rocks, I think, in the 1950s. And I think it's a nice reminder here that Kalaupapa is not a place that's defined only by, you know, suffering and injustice, but also by humor and joy and community and a kind of a sense of hope for the future. And I think that's an important aspect of Kalaupapa's history that we need to recognize. So I'll end there. Thank you all very much. Look forward to questions and comments.
Thank you so much, Chris. And thank you, Ka Ohulani, Hulani, you can put on your camera right now. We have time for a few questions. Okay, good to see you both. So we've had several questions. One question was, how did you address issues of integrity in the NHL update for the nomination? For example, this that was Wainani. She asked, I'm thinking about things like patients' beach houses that have deteriorated, but represent their determination to express autonomy.
Yeah, thank you. That's a good question. And I think, we recognize Kalaupapa has changed a lot even since the first nomination. It's such a harsh environment for these buildings to survive, and especially these the beach houses and a lot of the outbuildings that haven't really been maintained are really in a deteriorated state. But because they were being recognized as really significant, as these really resources that really reflect the lives and agency of the people of Kalaupapa, I think we can. They still really carry that significance and meaning, even though they're in a deteriorated state. And so, for that reason, I think, we're able to say that the property still has a high level of integrity, even as it changes and deteriorates over time, because we want to make sure that those stories are remembered.
Why does well, there are two questions that are kind of related. I mean, one is, were residents, this was Deborah, pre-1866 forcibly relocated from Kalaupapa?
You're talking about can you repeat that? The Hawaiians who were living on the peninsula before 1866?
I believe that's what she's referring to. And I think Chris kind of addressed that a little, but they stayed as long as they could, was I think what I heard in your presentation, Chris.
So yes, basically the Board of Health bought out the kuleana of the Native Hawaiians who were living there, but they didn't do it all at once. They started before, in 1865, they started buying out the kuleanas on the eastern side of the peninsula, Kalawao and Waikolu Valley. And the patients quickly outgrew those areas. And in 1873, they bought out the middle part of the peninsula, the Native Hawaiians that were there. And then in 1893, they bought out the rest of the people. And by 1895, the last Native tenant was forced to leave Kalaupapa. And it's unfortunate because I've looked at those records, and some of their kuleanas sold for $25. There's no rhyme or reason, that I could figure out. Probably the value of the land, if it had water on it, was more valuable to grow resources. But yes, so they were bought out by the Board of Health, but they didn't have a choice. They basically had to leave, and the choice was, you can take money for it, or we'll evict you. And they were at least given a choice of having lands on an island of their choice. And most of them chose to go topside Molokai. There are a few that went to other islands, but most of them went topside.
Thank you. What would you say, either Chris or Hulani, is the most significant change in interpretation based on the new research?
Well, I think from my perspective, I think just this real emphasis on the stories of the people themselves. I think when you read the original nomination and a lot of the early literature, historical literature about Kalaupapa, there's almost no patients that are even mentioned by name. They're a collective sort of group of sort of unfortunate victims, right? And I think with a lot of scholarship that's come out recently, as well as work by groups like Kalaupapa, I saw that mentioned in the chat there. They've really done a lot of work to really bring out those stories and bring in other sources, Hawaiian language newspapers, and through oral histories and other things to really bring that out. And I think that's probably the most significant change.
Yeah, I think for me, the information coming out of the Hawaiian language newspapers is hugely important because much of that was never translated before. So it's a lot more accessible to scholars and the general public. And there's so much interesting information in there from the voice of the patients themselves.
Mhm. It's quite a different perspective. Thank you both for sharing that. I think we're almost out of time, but I just was curious if Kalaupapa, the story of Kalaupapa, is taught in Hawaii public schools, and if so, is the National Park Service involved in that program?
It is taught. I think schools have come up with their own curriculum, you know, like I know Kamehameha Schools teaches it in their curriculum. What our education person does, ranger does, is she will present on specific topics to address classrooms when she's invited by teachers. But we haven't come up with a specific curriculum that's used statewide.
Thank you both so much. Thank you for that response, Hulani. I wish we had more time for questions, but I want to honor our 1 o'clock close, and we're a little bit over, which what I would say is, before I wrap up, is I think, Chris, you had put your email address in your slide, and I can include that. And then Hulani, if you're comfortable with that, or if you want us to field for you additional questions, we
No,
can.
I'm fine with that.
Okay, so
that, and it's like, you know, when you're presenting, you don't have time to look at the questions, but
yeah,
when Chris was talking, I was eyeing the chat, and there's a lot of questions in there that would be fun to answer for both Chris and I.
that would be great. So what I'll do is, for everyone who's still listening and those who put questions in the chat, I'm going to save that. We will put this in a follow-up email with Chris's and Ohulani's email addresses, so you can follow up with them. Please keep us copied, because that'd be really, really great to have that information. And maybe we can put that on our website as well, so that people who watch it afterwards can come back and close that out. So with that, I really want to thank you both so much. It's so interesting. I also want to mention that the updated nomination form is available on the Historic Hawaii Foundation Historic Property page on our website. And I want to thank everyone who's attended today, and hope you enjoyed this really interesting and informative presentation. There's lots more questions, especially how this relates to our current social and civic times, especially in the past year, but perhaps we can include that on our follow-up. And I want to thank you both for the time and energy, and also let everyone know that this expert series continues next week. We have our next lecture is it's actually a change to the original schedule, with Dr. Ron Williams Jr., who will present the Changing Lahaina Historic District, with a focus on Moku'ula, the royal compound in Lahaina, and the renewed interest in recent developments in its restoration. And then we also still invite you, if you haven't yet signed up for and are interested, to our partner event with Lion Arboretum about the cultural history and ethnobotany of Lion Arboretum and Manoa Valley, which is on February 17th. And then if you would like to support HHF and our work and help us continue such programming and outreach in the community, and sharing the many layers of history, there's many ways to do that. Please go to our website, historichawaii.org. And there's a join us section on the menu bar, which has a lot of different ways, including some of them volunteering or various ways that you can get more engaged with us. And please do sign up for our e-newsletter if you haven't yet done so. So with that, mahalo again to Chris and Hulani. I want to wish everyone a great rest of your week, and send you much aloha until we meet again, hopefully. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you so much.